Nick Holdstock is a journalist and writer whose work has appeared in publications around the world, including The Guardian, the London Review of Books, The Independent, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and the Dublin Review. He is the author of China's Forgotten People and Chasing the Chinese Dream, two titles from our IB Tauris list. We invited him in to talk about what has been a growing human rights crisis in China for the past 4 years. We discussed the work Nick has done investigating Xinjiang, the Uyghur population, and the largest known concentration camp network in the modern world, covering the history, politics, and misinformation behind it all. Take a listen.
This is the Bloomsbury Academic Podcast, and I'm your host, Rebecca Moravsky. I'm here today with Nick Holdstock, author of China's Forgotten People, a book about the Muslim Uyghur community who are currently being held in internment camps in the Xinjiang region of northwest China. Welcome, Nick. Looking forward to talking about a humanitarian crisis that is largely shrouded from the global community.
Thank you.
So what motivated you to write this book? What exactly is your background?
I first went to China in 1999, and I lived there for 2 years in Hunan province, which is, typical, if there is typical China, sort of central China, rice sort of field growing place. And after 2 years there, I went to teach in a city on the western border of China in Xinjiang, a city called in Uyghur Gulja, or in Uyghur, in Chinese it's called Yining. And I went there because I knew that Xinjiang was going to be a very different kind of China. I also knew that in Gulja in 1997 there had been large protests against the government, and at that time no foreign reporters were allowed in that region, and they were it was a very sort of mysterious thing that had happened. So I went there with some intention of trying to sort of understand, how that happened. And I lived there for a year. And while I was, being a good English teacher, I got to sort of know as much as I could something about the town and the different communities in the town. It's hard to sort of convey, like the contrast between going from central China to Xinjiang in terms of, just how different it feels, both then and now for different reasons. In terms of it being like feeling that I was walking into a part of Central Asia often, in terms of the way people looked, the things that were sold in the markets, the languages I heard. And so in one level, this was a very kind of a wonderful, great experience. But on the other level, there was, an immediate sort of very quick sense that this was a very divided place, that there was, essentially a Han Chinese part of the town, Han being the ethnic majority in China, and a Uyghur part of town. And there being these very different sort of split communities who really barely even shared the same space within the town, and when they did, would almost act like the others didn't even exist. If anyone's ever read China Mayville's The City in the City, there was some of that sort of strange sense of people, just really trying to ignore each other in some ways. The more time I spent in Gulja, the more I sort of began to understand some of the reasons why there was this sort of separation. In terms of not just government policy, but also the way that just individuals viewed each other, the way that Han Chinese people had stereotypes about Uyghurs, and Uyghurs had stereotypes about Han Chinese people that, kind of kept them apart all the time. So I was sort of felt strange to be in the middle of this. And sort of by sort of almost the end of my sort of first year there, I sort of began to understand some of the, the very sort of strict restrictions that there were on Uyghur life there in terms of not just how they worshipped, but how their kids went to school, The difficulty they had finding jobs compared to Han Chinese people, sort of very institutionalized, formalized restrictions that in some cases were almost like a sort of system of apartheid. So that was sort of my primary direct experience of living in Xinjiang. And then, then I left. And I guess since then I've been writing and thinking about the place and trying to sort of, keep track of it and to sort of try and understand, what's been going on since then. So I guess I wrote my first book was a memoir about living there called The Tree That Bleeds, which is a very sort of direct first person, completely ignorant person's sort of viewpoint on the place. And this new book, China's Forgotten People, is a sort of more sort of formal, sort of semi-academic kind of view of the place in terms of the history and the culture and the politics of it. So I guess, the sort of my two books on another writing is trying to sort of give sort of a more rounded sort of sense of what's happening there.
Absolutely. And I mean, for people who don't know much about what's going on, can you give a quick history lesson on why Uyghurs in China are being targeted in the first place and what exactly are the most important takeaways?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, in terms of history, we kind of have to go quite far back and think about really the history of China as a whole. And this sort of what you look at now when you look at China on the map, this sort of very large area, is a semi sort of modern construction. If you go back, 3 or 4 centuries, like China was a lot smaller, in terms of land mass and territory. And it's only sort of really with sort of successive, sort of dynasties, if you like, that sort of it has expanded across the map. So I guess my point here is that what we see as Xinjiang now, on the map as part of China, was, is in some ways quite a semi-recent sort of addition, sort of mid-18th century under the Qing dynasty. Before then it was sort of, it was a region that was sometimes sort of under the control of, whoever was in charge of China at the time, and other times was sort of almost completely sort of separate. And, if you think about how long it used to take to go from, say, Beijing to Xinjiang, sort of months essentially, then you sort of understand how it could be so remote. There's an excellent book by David Brophy called Uyghur Nation, in which he sort of suggests that one way to think about Xinjiang as a territory is almost like as a place, almost like a treaty port place, where it's the areas that most affected it, like what is now Kazakhstan, Russia, India, Pakistan. Those areas were the areas that kind of helped shape it very much in terms of language, religion, culture, and these kinds of things. So in terms of, I guess the take-home point from this is that Xinjiang, hasn't always been a part of China, and nor have the people there always been a part of China. So there is a cultural, linguistic distinctness about the place, and with that comes an identity that's separate from mainland China today. Pause for breath. But it's only really since 1949, when the People's Republic of China was founded, that Xinjiang has been this sort of cohesive territory that's been, very much, under the control of, the Chinese rulers, if you like. Before then it's sort of this very sort of spotty, patchy sort of record. So, again, that's quite a recent thing in terms of, trying to, in terms of its actual integration into China itself. And following that, following 1949, there has been, huge changes in the region. One of which is like a huge demographic shift. It used to be that Han Chinese in the region were, roughly sort of 5% of the population, and successive waves of sort of internal migration from central China into Xinjiang have shifted that demographic massively, so that it's now, depending on who you talk to, between sort of 40 to 50% of the population. So there is a sort of, if you like, a kind of a colonialization narrative there, you could argue. And with that massive demographic shift, there has been a shift in control over, essentially who controls the land and the resources of Xinjiang. One of the big elements of this resettlement of Han Chinese through internal migration was the establishment of these camps called Bingtuan, which was set up for sort of demobilized soldiers as a sort of, it's a bit of a crude comparison, but as almost like a sort of kibbutzim kinds of place, whereby they would control, the land and the resources, and they would essentially, sort of become sort of the major agricultural sort of force in the region, which is, in one ways you could see as the development of the region, but from another perspective you could say that they were taking, the land and resources from the people who were already living there, mostly the Uyghurs. So, that's a huge shift that happened as well. I guess the other sort of next key date is to think about the way that China as a whole changed once it opened up in the late 70s under Deng Xiaoping, when suddenly the state took a step back a little bit and started to let people, have businesses, create free enterprise, this kind of thing. And, from that period, a lot of the inequalities, not just in Xinjiang, but throughout China, began to widen. There are some people who were still like in the state system, and there were some people who were outside it and making a lot of money. Sort of the logical continuation, given, is what we can see today, arguably. And in Xinjiang, through the 80s and through the 90s, there was this sort of widening gap between Uyghurs and Han Chinese, again, crudely, between the north and the south of the province, of the region, most Uyghurs being in the south of the region, that has, created this sense that there's almost a two-tier system going on. Again, a little bit like a system of apartheid. And for example, one aspect of which is that some of the best jobs in Xinjiang have been either in the oil industry or on these Bingtuan, these state farms that are all over the region. And in both the oil industry and in these state farms, basically no Uyghurs are actually employed. So they were kind of systematically sort of excluded from, arguably the best economic opportunities that there were. And then I guess that the next key date really is to think about 9/11 and how, that made many regimes around the world think that they had an opportunity or a narrative, if you like, that they could use to deal with, their own internal dissent, especially if those people were Muslim. And since sort of 9/11, essentially the Chinese government has been arguing that it's been targeted by sort of Uyghur fundamentalist terrorists who want to separate Xinjiang from the rest of China. So, if you put all these things together, there's a sort of, there's a distinctiveness between, Uyghurs and Han, culturally, linguistically. There's, a sense of grievance and disparity, economically and culturally between Uyghurs and Han. And then there's the things that the state has been doing, particularly since 2002, which have further aggravated this sort of, the tensions and the resentment between Uyghurs and Han, in the region. And when I say Uyghurs, what I should really be saying is Uyghurs, Kazakhs, Hui, and other people, because there are many ethnic groups in the region. but Uyghurs being the majority, there's sort of that's the way we tend to talk about what's happening in the region.
So you've described some of the reasoning behind the government cracking down on the Uyghur community in the Xinjiang region. Do you feel that what exactly do Uyghurs want? Do you feel like there's a consensus, or is there more of a plurality in the community?
It's a great question, and it's been a great question for decades, and it's essentially unanswerable because nobody really has access to enough people in Xinjiang who can actually give a free answer to that question. The most vocal people from the region have mostly been outside the region for understandable reasons. So organizations like the World Uyghur Congress and others, who claim to speak for Uyghurs within China. And some of those organizations have claimed that what Uyghurs want is full independence. Some of them have claimed that Uyghurs want autonomy within China. The full official name of Xinjiang is the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, which, like the Tibetan Autonomous Region, suggests that, legally these regions should have a little bit more, as the word says, autonomy. So, there have been different sort of positions occupied on that continuum between autonomy and full independence. In terms of what most people actually want who are living in Xinjiang, as I say, it's not exactly possible to say. To sort of flip the question, it's maybe easier to say what they don't want. They don't want to be put into internment camps. They want to speak their own language. They want the freedom to worship. They want jobs. They basically want the sort of, I don't think I'm going out on a limb to say they basically want the same things that people all over the world want to be able to do. But as I say, for a number of institutional reasons and policy reasons, they just haven't been allowed to do.
So, mentioning the internment camps, it's now predicted, we're not so clear on these numbers, but it's predicted that there's up to 1 million Uyghur people in these quote-unquote re-education camps. What exactly, if you know anything at all, is actually going on in these re-education camps or internment camps?
Yeah, the numbers are, a sort of thing that we're still arguing about. And I think some quite reasonable people are now saying that it may be 2 million who have been in these camps. However, from what we can tell about the camps, because obviously the journalists are not allowed in there, it's a place in which every aspect of people's daily life is controlled. From the moment they wake up early until they go to bed, people don't have any privacy, and they're forced to conform to a very tightly regimented sort of schedule. Ranges, so in the morning, for example, the people have to attend a flag raising ceremony, and then they have breakfast, and before breakfast they have to give up like a pledge of allegiance to the nation and to affirm the all-seeing goodness of the Communist Party. And then after that they spend most of the day either watching political films or being forced to take Mandarin classes, because some Uyghurs don't speak very good Mandarin, it being their second or third language. And there are study sessions in which people have to confess their mistakes. They have to say, they're encouraged to say, oh, in the past I went to the mosque too often, or in the past I did this, or I said this. And they have to sort of show some sort of contrition and repentance. And some people who don't do this, we have reports that they are, put under both mental and physical duress. There have been allegations of torture, starvation, beatings, all kinds of things like this. And then there's another meal in which people again have to sort of stand up and pledge their allegiance to the government. And sort of it goes on, days, weeks, months of this. And, it's probably quite hard for any of us to sort of actually fully understand how terrible this is. It's, I guess my point is that the effects of this are likely to last a very long time, even for people when they are released from these camps. The psychological scars of this are not going to go away. So these camps are been built very quickly, and sort of they only really date from sort of 2016, 2017, and they from the outside, although they're called re-education centres, they look like prisons. They have barbed wire around them. There are armed guards there. People are not allowed to leave. They may occasionally be allowed visitors, but it is absolutely basically like a prison, even though nobody in those places has been actually charged with a crime. The reason they're there is because they've committed some kind of sort of apparent sort of political misstep or some social misstep, or because they, for example, I mean, there's a long list of semi-arbitrary reasons, like your beard was too long, you have too many knives in your house, you have too much food in your house, you have a friend in a foreign country who messages you on WhatsApp, you've been to a foreign country, or you are related to someone who's done any of these things. So, there's essentially the authorities have thrown a net over society in Xinjiang, and pretty much anybody, that they want can actually just be put in, hence millions of people being in there. I mean, academics have been put in there, artists, pretty much everybody from every aspect of life in Xinjiang, has been or could be put in to one of these internment camps.
Right. I mean, and it's also notable that now all of their public intellectuals they're making a point of putting their public intellectuals in these camps as a way probably to censor criticism. I mean, considering China's ability to restrict information of what internally happens in the country, how do we actually know these things? And can you speak to the reporting conditions in general in Xinjiang?
Yeah, I mean, it's instructive to think about what people within China, what their view of these places is. And, in a place, where the media and the internet is so tightly controlled, most people in China, for instance, only think of these places as good places, probably. On TV, they have been shown footage of apparently happy or at least docile people in these re-education places where they're learning vocational skills. Where there are, sports facilities and a cinema and hairdressing salons and things like that. So there are these sort of strange Potemkin sort of village versions of the camps that have, that are offered for consumption both internally and, I think last year some foreign reporters were allowed in one as well. So, however, the reason why we know this isn't the case, is I guess from three sort of major sources of information. And so the most primary of which, the initial one of which, was reports from people who had been released from the camps or who had been working in the camps. And most of those people were in Kazakhstan after coming out. And there they started sort of sharing their stories about what had happened. And, there's an incredible convergence in these testimonies. If you go onto the Human Rights Watch or Amnesty websites, you'll find and you read these harrowing testimonies, but there is this great sort of convergence and in terms of their descriptions about what life is like inside these places. And then I guess the second one is that we've been physically able to see, the construction of these camps all over Xinjiang, over time using satellite sort of imagery, and they all show, former schools, former factories, or new facilities just literally sort of being built out of nothing, often, in a very short space of time. That's, it shows there's been a concerted attempt to create these things. And the other sort of side of it is actually just from official government documents that show the incredible amount of money that's been spent in recruiting people to staff these places. Huge increases in sort of essentially the custodial and the police sort of budgets for all these areas. There has also been a little bit of video smuggled out of some stuff in the camps, which is, maybe sort of not quite as clear about what's happening in some of those videos. But yeah, in terms of what foreign reporters could actually do in Xinjiang, basically any foreign reporter who goes in there will be followed around all day and often obstructed from going to certain places. Their footage can be confiscated. They can just be kind of detained and then deported. We've seen just this week with the Wall Street Journal reporters who've just been kicked out of China as well for their reporting of the coronavirus. China has multiple ways to sort of deal with foreign reporters, ranging from obstruction to just kicking them out, So yeah, there have been, obviously people in Xinjiang are incredibly frightened and it's incredible risk for them to be seen talking to a foreign journalist or maybe just even any foreigner at this point. But there have been some people who have been able to get some testimony from brave people, who either have been in the camps or who have relatives who have been in the camps. So we also know, a lot of stuff that is far more than just anecdotal. That it's, that it all kind of coheres in a way that's far more than suggestive about what's going on in there. There's a great piece by a guy called Gene Bunin who spent a lot of time in Xinjiang just talking to people mostly in restaurants, quite informally, and that gives a really good sort of sense of just sort of how devastating this has been for Uyghur and Kazakh and other communities within Xinjiang.
Were people opening up to him in these more casual contexts, or was he just sort of inferring what people were not saying?
A bit of both. I think a lot of the time people, were speaking quite indirectly, which is the same way that people, tend to talk about these things on the internet in China as well. For all the incredible surveillance in China, not every word that's typed from the computer can be seen. And there is a kind of a constant sort of arms race, if you like, between people looking for, ways to sort of say things without saying them as well. So yeah, there is this sort of, obviously, I think this is probably a sort of a tension between people being on the one hand terrified of speaking about what's happening to them and their relatives and their friends, but also having a need to actually say this, look, this is happening. People need to know.
And I know that you didn't really do that much interviewing for this book and not in China. You interviewed people in the diaspora, but what was your personal experience just walking around China, living there as a journalist, but also as a foreigner? Were people willing to talk to you, or were they a bit more reserved?
I think there was certain, it was a movable thing, really. It sort of depended how well you knew the person, sort of where you were. When I lived in Xinjiang, almost sort of 20 years ago, when I first went there, even then, there were a lot of topics that could not be talked about, amongst, both Uyghur and Han. And it was quite hard to know how to broach things. And you sort of, after a while, you start almost censoring yourself and almost avoiding the sensitive topics. So it sort of, it perpetuates itself. And yet, I guess anyone who's lived in China or spent any time there will know that people in China are not afraid to speak negatively about many aspects of the system. There are very few people who would not not admit that there is widespread corruption in China, for example. Like, that is a safe thing to say, partly because the government also says it too. It's a sort of a question of who you think is corrupt and how extensive and deep the corruption goes. So like there are all kinds of topics that are, you are allowed to talk about. You are allowed to acknowledge that the country has problems, for example. It's a question of how you do it and who you blame. And, but the tricky thing is for people is that sort of the red line about what's acceptable is always shifting. And even people in the media don't really know, so an editorial that maybe you wrote 6 months ago, which was fine and wasn't censored, can suddenly get you in trouble later on. Which is a sort of classic sort of Stalinist thing, where, there's no statute of limitations on anything you ever say, really. You can always go back and find something. And that does sort of inculcate a sort of a reserve, if you like, and I think especially older people in China tend to have, very long memories of maybe now not of sort of Maoist sort of time, but of times when the goalposts have shifted, if you like. Especially under Xi Jinping, where, in many aspects freedoms have been curtailed that were beginning to grow. That's a very sobering lesson for a lot of people, I think.
Right. Actually, on that note, how has President Xi Jinping's policies differed from his predecessors? In this context,
so, up until sort of 2013, 2014, there was a sort of a slightly distorted semblance of normal life in Xinjiang. There were a lot of restrictions on people's daily lives. There was a very heavy police and military presence on the streets. But, you could go shopping, you could go to the mosque, you could, you could sort of almost lead a semi sort of normal life, if you like. But after Xi Jinping took over, and also after Xinjiang got a new sort of top official, Chen Guangguo, those two sort of shifts, if you like, led to, a massive crackdown on daily life in Xinjiang. It's sort of 2014, 2015 when these huge digital surveillance networks start being sort of transplanted into the centers of major cities in Xinjiang. That's when, there's a lot more public campaigns against religion, against how women dress, against many aspects of Uyghur culture, and academia. So there's, as in the rest of China under Xi Jinping, there's a tightening of the screw, and there's a sort of a shift sort of back to, an attempt to actually control, people's sort of ideological, if you like, sort of horizons. It's not, people will no longer just being asked to sort of be good consumers and be sort of quietly good citizens. A lot more was suddenly expected of people, not just in Xinjiang, but throughout China. So what has happened in Xinjiang under Xi Jinping is consistent with what's happened throughout the country in some ways, but in other ways it's far more extreme, and it suggests that there is that Xinjiang under Xi Jinping and perhaps under previous officials as well, is essentially seen as a problem that has to be solved, that there aren't just these sort of few bad apples that have to be targeted. That now, essentially under Xi Jinping, to be Uyghur as an identity with all that entails is now itself the problem. So the camps are one aspect of this attempt to sort of solve the problem of being Uyghur. And by that I mean, if you think about what an identity involves, it involves everything from the language you speak to what you believe or don't believe. It involves how you dress, It involves your leisure time, your culture, the books you like to read. I mean, pretty much every aspect at this point of being Uyghur in Xinjiang is essentially seen as problematic by the state. And even if you have not been put into a camp, pretty much every other aspect of your life has been or will be most likely, essentially seen as problematic. So under Xi Jinping, there has been this qualitative shift in the response to Xinjiang, which is, it's quite startling in the way that it sort of has conceptualized what they see as the problem of the region. There's been a debate within, I should say, of course, that the Chinese Communist Party is a very opaque institution where we've often struggled to even understand that there might be debates, let alone the content of the debates within, the organization. However, from reading sort of official Communist Party sort of journals and speeches, we've been able to sort of figure out that there has been some kind of debate about, if you like, the orthodox Marxist view on the issue of ethnicity in China, and one school of thought has been that sort of ethnicity is this kind of sort of retrograde thing that will sort of naturally fade away, as you build a strong country and as you sort of homogenize the country sort of politically and socially. And so as a problem, it would just quietly go away on as a result of doing other kinds of things. And then the other kind of sort of school of thought has been that actually ethnicity is something that's standing in the way of development, and that you have to then, essentially actively try to eradicate it. And until maybe sort of 2014, it wasn't quite clear maybe where the policy was headed. There was some debate. But everything that Xi Jinping has done since taking office suggests that there's nothing really that they want to preserve about Uyghur or Kazakh identity, or probably any other ethnic identity in China, and that all these things essentially should go away, and everybody should just be a Chinese citizen first and foremost. Nothing else should really matter. Under Xi Jinping, it couldn't really be a starker difference.
Yeah, and you've probably hinted at the answer to this already, but do you think that this is China's main motivation for spurring ethnic violence in this current context? Because clearly, as you've explained, the tensions between the government and the Uyghurs has existed for a long time now.
Yeah, the tensions have been there. But in terms of the violence, I think I should sort of say something about that, because the way that Xinjiang is often characterized in the media, as this sort of violent, dangerous sort of place, sort of like China's, Chechnya or something, and the reality of it has been very different. There have been a number of sort of violent incidents over the last 3 decades, but the majority of time the dissent and the tensions there, have not been expressed in terms of violence at all. And when violence has broken out, it has tended to be in sort of quite sporadic, spontaneous ways that are not sort of not the result of any sort of great organized, terror group, for example. It tends to be things like there's a village and somebody's son has been arrested, and because the police have a bad record, often people being arrested sometimes disappear and never come back. Often then people will go to the police station, like local, people, relatives, and they might say, for example, protest against, the detention of the son. And then maybe, a police person might fire at them, and somebody might be killed, and then there would be a violent sort of confrontation. So these are sort of a lot of the incidents that have happened there have seem to have been in this kind of pattern. So the violence is sort of something that is something that's, I think of it as something that is like a pressure cooker, that at times the tension has built and the resentment has built, and that has resulted in these sort of uncontrolled, often, pieces of violence. And it's really only a few incidents, recent incidents like the attack on the Kunming train station in 2014 and some bombings in Urumqi in 2014 and 2015, which actually looked like what we might think of as a terrorist incident, but it's very easy to look at those incidents and then think, oh yes, everything else is terrorism, which is essentially the Chinese government's sort of view. So, finally, to get back to your question, I mean, I don't think that necessarily the government are trying to provoke violence as such, but I don't think they mind very much because it only bolsters their narrative, if you like. I think it's that they anticipate, naturally that there will be some resistance and resentment against their policies, but they're not really, there's no chance that they're going to lose control of the region. The region is the most heavily policed, heavily militarized part of China. That was even true, 10, 15 years ago, and it's even more true now. So at this point, anything that happens, they will be able to control very easily. And the violence is, as long as it stays within certain boundaries, I think, is not really like an issue for them. However, interestingly enough, there have been reports in the last sort of 6-9 months, since I finished the book, that some of the most sort of visible securitization and especially surveillance in Xinjiang has been slightly scaled back a bit. There'll still be lots of soldiers on the streets, people say, and there's still, like checks on people's phones and things like that. But there has been a suggestion that there has been a slight, not an easing off by any means, but a slight shift in the way that the state is asserting itself within Xinjiang. And the reason for that, I think, is not because they're worried about violence. I think they're more worried about the fact that locking up several million people, has had a massive effect on the economy of the region. And, that people from inner China, internal migrants from China who were living in Xinjiang have been leaving because they can't do business either under these conditions as well. So if there is a kind of a constituency that the government tend to be sensitive to in Xinjiang, it's not Uyghurs or Kazakhs, it's the Han Chinese who are there. Those are the people who they, are probably interested in trying to appease. And they're as good a reason, if any, why they don't want things to get too out of control.
Right. I mean, they must be sensitive to the economy, both internally and externally. I mean, given what we know about the camps, how have Muslim majority countries reacted to the crisis? And has that shifted the way that China has been implementing the camps at all?
I mean, I think, it's hard to know to what degree, external opinion can affect Chinese policy. It would be lovely to think that, that it can have a very direct and strong opinion, a direct and strong effect. If, for example, as they did, the United Nations condemned the camps and expressed, strong concern and all that. But, it's very hard to sort of read what really is going on at that level. But in terms of, like many, some countries have come out quite strongly against the camps. But in most cases, this has not gone beyond, expressing concern. And many, Muslim majority countries, have not, expressed great concern and have, actually not really seemed to be too bothered. Like you can contrast, for example, Turkey, who in, 2009, they were willing to call some actions of the Chinese state as being like a sort of a genocide, whereas now they're like, the foreign minister said a few years ago, he said, we won't let anybody criticize, China who lives in Turkey, so like they have, it's, as China has become more important as an economic power, it's, many countries are not interested in looking for sort of domestic support by opposing China. It's only probably in places like America where the Republicans can make considerable political capital out of opposing China. That it's sort of a good cause, if you like. I mean, China in that way is like the way that Russia used to be and still is. It's a great enemy to attack. Which you can do if you're a Republican in America, but maybe if you're a politician in another country who has very strong trade ties with China and really relies on China, then maybe there's no reason for you to try and sort of make domestic political capital out of it. We can sort of look at, for example, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which is like an umbrella organization for, I think, like 53 different Islamic countries. And, they have a website that anybody can go on, an English website, which has a list of things that they, sort of are very concerned about or things that they sort of are worried about. And if you type like Uyghur or Xinjiang in there, you really get very little out of it. You don't get much about, if anything, about the camps. Whereas if you type in like the Rohingya or peoples or Palestinians, there's like pages and pages of stuff. So China's, very central position in the world economy, plus also its political support for many other countries that have very bad human rights records, means that, many countries have not been willing to sort of step up and are probably not going to either.
I mean, well, speaking of Republicans, how does Western Islamophobia, as opposed to Muslim countries, how does Islamophobia configure in the global community's reaction to the crisis?
Well, it's interesting because, I mean, when I first wrote China's Forgotten People, when the first edition came out in sort of 2015, I felt like that book came out of a sort of a frustration, if you like, with sort of the dominant sort of narrative, which was that Xinjiang was this place full of Islamist terrorists. And whilst there were some, human rights violations there, nonetheless, China was sort of, had its own part in the global war on terror. And, so that was sort of, that was sort of the way that the place was viewed. And, I think there were some sort of US congressional committees on China that did sort of express concern around, human rights issues at that time. But that kind of story was, if you like, was kind of getting lost under the terrorism angle, because it makes great news copy, And so I guess one of the reasons there was that I wrote that first edition of the book was that frustration about there not being enough context to say, yes, there have been some incidents recently, but this is by no means representative of what's going on. Now, with this new edition of the book, I feel that firstly, more people around the world have actually heard of even who the Uyghurs are. 5 years ago, it was an uphill battle to try and even get people to understand that there were Muslims in China. But now with the camps, I feel that it's now sort of the spin on the story, if you like, in terms of the international media and within, international politics is now shifted in such a way that, that there is, a lot more sympathy for them. So in some ways the story, is the same. In some ways it's different. But I think it's for the better that we're looking now more at, what's going on there rather than just, having these sort of opinion op-ed pieces, about, China's internal Taliban or whatever,
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. For me, just from my vantage point as an American, it's interesting that this is all, what you're saying is interesting against the backdrop of, Trump's Muslim ban, for instance, and the social capital that Republicans and conservatives in this country do get from invoking Islamophobic sentiment. So I don't know. It's interesting that you're saying that there has been more sympathy in the media or more of a sense of urgency in Western media about.
Yeah, I mean, but in terms of, I guess, the forces within the Trump administration, it's only really like Rubio and a few other people who have really championed this cause, of the Uyghurs. And there's a lot of, in my own personal opinion, there's a lot of reasons why, there's a lot of reasons why you wouldn't make common cause or approve of much of what Rubio does. But it clearly has some political capital for him that he can be seen to be being tough on China. Now, whatever his motivations, it's a good thing, I think, that, that the US, the Congress has passed resolutions against it, I don't know how far it's going to go. For example, many US companies do considerable business with organizations or businesses in Xinjiang, major corporations, source a lot of their cotton from Xinjiang or their tomatoes for their ketchup from Xinjiang. I don't know whether any, for example, American political figure is going to suggest that that shouldn't be allowed to happen, and there should be some ban on sourcing from a place where there are these known violations of human rights. So, I guess to say, in some ways, it's like there can only be so much. The Islamophobia can only sort of be suspended for a certain amount of time, I think, or for a certain extent.
And for individuals, because we know so little, because it feels, because it feels like the international community has largely not done much to crack down on China because of its its human rights violations. What are some ways that individuals can actually get involved and help?
If you're an American, then you should, talk to your congressman or your or to your senator, and ask them to support what's going on in there. If you're in other countries, you again should ask your elected representatives to do something about it and to raise questions. I think, you can be cynical and say, I'm not sure anything's going to happen, but I think it doesn't hurt to at least keep it on the agenda when, the agenda is constantly shifting and there are constantly things, happening. I think it's easy to sort of slip out of the news, for the story to slip out of the news cycle, but it doesn't mean it isn't still happening. There are, as a consumer, you can do things. You can not buy cotton products that are sourced from within China. There have been lots of retailers who've directly profited from cotton sourced from China. So, if you wanted to, you could boycott H&M or Gap or Adidas or lots of other organizations. I think, in a way, as a consumer, is one of the most sort of powerful things that you can do. Really, is to not support these things and to make companies aware that there is a cost of them doing business with a repressive regime. You can also sort of contribute directly to organizations that are helping to support not just the spreading of awareness, but also people who have been, people and their families who have been affected by the camps. There's something called the Xinjiang Victims Database, which is collecting testimonies of people in the camp survivors. And that's like an important way to sort of help publicize what's happening. And in some cases, those testimonies have helped to arrange the release of people from the camps. I think there's also, on a sort of more informal sort of level, I think it's important to try and find a way to engage with people, especially Chinese people, who either don't know much about the camps or who think that the camps are a good thing and that are, just sort of helping China. Like, especially if you live or work on an academic campus, I think that for a lot of Chinese young people, there's sort of, they hear one thing, from their own state media, and then they come here and they hear a bunch of other different things. And I think it can be difficult to have a sort of a clear and calm debate with people who don't necessarily, see the camps in the same way. But I think that, it's very easy to say, there are these terrible camps and your government's awful. But that doesn't usually work out very well in my experience. You have to find some way to engage and just say, here's this evidence. And what do you think of this? So I think there's lots of things that people can do at different levels. It's a complex issue, and it's right now it's not quite on the top of the news agenda for various reasons, but it's an ongoing thing. And I think that it's, I think that, there is I think it isn't going to go away, for example. So yeah, it would be very good if people could find some way to do something.
Well, we only have time for one more question, but you've already kind of touched on this. There's clearly so much going on in China right now. It's not just the Uyghur camps, it's the global trade war and now the coronavirus. There's just a lot going on, clearly. Do you have any predictions or do you anticipate certain scenarios of how this will all play out for China internally and on the global stage in the coming years?
I mean, the what is the future of China question is always, it's a great one, and I probably would answer it differently on different days. I think that internally the camps are probably not going to destabilize the regime at all. I mean, I think the camps, in particular are going to have a generational impact in Xinjiang in terms of, the damage it's done to people and communities and to any prospect of sort of better relations between the people of Xinjiang and the authorities. I suspect that what the Chinese government thought of as their great solution to the problem is actually going to perpetuate and deepen the problem for the next few decades, if not longer. In terms of like the coronavirus and the trade war, I mean, the coronavirus is, I'm not an expert on this at all, but I think that it's not going to, it's not going to destabilize the regime. I think that it's, like SARS didn't destabilize the regime, and arguably they've had a lot more practice since then in terms of how to manage these kinds of things. I think they'll have a narrative that will, that people will sort of not oppose very much. It's my mind starts to sort of spiral. It starts as soon as I even try to begin to think about the future of China. I mean, because it could go so many different ways, like some of the surveillance technology that is being used in Xinjiang is used throughout China already. There are facial recognition scanners. There are these social credit networks that people may have heard of. Like China could become considerably more authoritarian than it is right now. That is one possibility. Or it could go, it could slightly ease off a little bit, as well over the next few years. I mean, it depends on so many different factors, both within and outside China, which is to sort of avoid the question, I guess, as well. But, I guess this is one reason why China is, endlessly fascinating for me, is because, it's the thing that I sort of know most about and understand the least in some ways. So, I mean, it doesn't sort of become less interesting.
I mean, this might sound a little trite, but are you optimistic on certain days?
Some days. I mean, some days, like there are lots of good things that have happened in China over the last sort of 50 years. Like if you look at where the country was in 1949 compared to now, it's an unbelievable story, and you could concentrate on, the lifting of people out of poverty, the improvement in daily living and medical facilities, but on a bad day, you could look at the way that the Chinese environment is being like catastrophically polluted, by having industrialization within several decades, so, the legacy of that is going to continue. I think I'm optimistic and pessimistic at the same time. Like, I think that there are none of these problems are insoluble, but the question is, is the way in which they're going to be solved going to be more or less, I was about to say catastrophic for people. That's not quite the right word, but more or less, like how will ordinary people's experience, be shifting in China? Will the gap between the rich and the poor begin to narrow? Because right now the gap between the rich and the poor is widening in China, especially between the countryside and the city. So, it's like they have a lot of the problems of a normally capitalist country, but they have this almost unique kind of political system, which is either going to make it more difficult or easier to try and fix these things. Again, that's probably not much of an answer.
No, I mean, it's almost a rhetorical question, isn't it? There are endless possibilities. It really depends on so many different scenarios playing out, including outside of the country, whatever this administration is in 2020 in November. I think that will probably also play an impact, but thank you so much for really illuminating me, because personally, I didn't really know much about, the Uyghur crisis before reading your book. So, I feel really grateful to have been talking to you about this.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. I mean, it's, like talking about these things is stimulating for me as well. So.
Great. Well, to everybody listening, you can find Nick's book on Bloomsbury's website. It's China's Forgotten People, which I'll link in the show notes. Thank you so much.